welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kaliagin here with another week of World War III analysis. I know we're a little bit late, but I've been doing all sorts of things, so bear with us. I know there's been a lot of news. We're going to be talking about impending, expanding World War III in Lebanon as Israel prepares to strike back against Hezbollah for this recent strike in the Golan Heights on this Druze village. This is a huge story. We're going to break all of that down. Of course, there's big things going on in Ukraine and Russia with potential negotiations. Erdogan is making big waves talking about Turkey potentially entering Israel. Again, a lot of big news and comments this week. Cyprus talking about being involved in potential evacuations of people from the Holy Land, from Israel. We're talking about Venezuelan elections, which are an unfolding disaster as we speak. Going to be talking about the East a little bit, as well as some church news. So a big episode of World War Now, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Yes, certainly a lot of news from all around the world, especially the Africa region, the Middle East, Russia, regarding church news. A lot of updates for you guys. And of course, domestically from the United States and France, the European Olympics and all of that great stuff, which I think you'll all enjoy listening to, our analysis of it. But moving firstly to the Middle East, in Palestine, on the Golan Heights, so essentially not even Palestine at this point. We're talking about Syria, occupied by Israel since 1967, the Six-Day War. And in the village of Majal Shams, a very tragic accident has taken place. And I say accident because whichever side shot the missile, it was most likely not supposed to aim at the football field, which killed 12 teenagers of Druze descendants and heritage. And this is a town, Majal Shams is located in the Golan Heights, essentially because the Golan Heights is essentially a series of mountains, and this particular town is located like in a valley, and so as soon as the missile flew over the hill, it was bound to land somewhere, and it landed literally in a football field where these young, I suppose, not destitute, but these are not people from the richest backgrounds. If you can imagine, from literally the Golan Heights, like this territory which is disputed area, playing football, what people usually do in second and third world countries, just enjoying themselves, and the missile killed 12 of them. And of course, these people are of Druze heritage. A lot of them had Syrian passports. Many of them, their parents were actually citizens of Syria, not even citizens of Israel. So they were living under Israeli occupation, and allegedly a Hezbollah missile on accident flew in and killed them. Also 40 plus people were injured, but it was just quite a tragedy because we have heard of innocents being slaughtered, and I mean still being slaughtered around Rafah and the Gaza Strip, but rarely do we have such a misfire of this sort of proportion, because there is no military base located at Majal Shams, not so deep inside the suburban areas where there's literally a football field located. And of course, Netanyahu, Conrad, has used this to his benefit, because again, he flew in like a Druze elder to himself, and he was located in some military base, and he shook hands with this old man with a white beard, wearing like a turban or something, and essentially claimed that, look, the Hezbollah Sunni Shia terrorists that essentially attacking, I say Shia because, it's all Iran funded, because the entire Iran being the bad guys and the main enemy of the axis of resistance is being, expanded upon right now, not just by the US, but also by Israel, which probably will lead us deep into World War III. And I think that's probably the last stage of the conflict, is the Great War with Iran, which is kind of what we're building towards here. But yeah, it's really weird how Netanyahu essentially has this interview of the Druze fellow. They shake hands on camera, take photographs, and now Israel claims to be pro-Druze, pro-native, against these Islamic extremist aggressors in the face of Hezbollah. And naturally, this bombardment by Hezbollah has been ongoing, and you can probably understand, Conrad, eventually like a missile is going to misfire and hit the wrong target, but Israel has been literally doing the same thing for literally months on end since October 7th, and we're almost at the 1 year anniversary of the beginning of the October occupation of Gaza by Israel. And still, the world, besides of course the international courts, has not really renounced Israel, denounced it properly, and even the Islamic countries haven't moved in. So there is this hypocrisy by Israel, claiming that no other side can misfire these missiles and cause these tragedies to take place. A very similar situation in Ukraine and Russia, I think. But just want to get your thoughts on what exactly is taking place between Hezbollah and Israel, because it's heating up to a great extent, and even the rhetoric from Nasrallah and Iran being involved as well, it's looking quite hot this week and even this fortnight.
Well, we are now awaiting the Israeli response. The rumor is that they are going to strike Beirut. Some say they're even going to strike the Beirut airport, which is now completely empty of planes. Most major airlines have canceled and stopped running their flights to Lebanon. Most countries have asked their citizens to leave Lebanon. So this assault, mostly on southern Lebanon, but also supposedly nationwide by the IDF and their aerial forces, is about to happen. This may have already occurred by the time you're listening to this episode, and we're already hearing about Hezbollah, Iran, and the Axis of Resistance's preparation for their response to this Israeli strike. And we have the new Iranian president, Pezeshkian, talking to American counterparts and French counterparts and Europeans that if Israel responds how we think they are going to respond, that Iran is going to have to dramatically escalate the situation and perhaps, have some of its supporters enter Israeli claimed territory. Perhaps Iranian troops in the IRGC itself will become more active in strikes on American bases in Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and all of these places that the Axis of Resistance has started bombing again. We know that some of these bases have now been under fire for 2 weeks again, which stopped a while back after the beginning of October 7th, and it seems that has resumed now that the Axis of Resistance has been standing in solidarity with the Houthis, who have been facing strikes, as well as their naval blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea has been more and more successful. But the situation with the Druze is so interesting because it shows you, the diversity of all these areas and how even the smallest, most forgotten about kind of ancient, pre-Abrahamic, you could almost call it, groups are still being caught up. And it shows you how regional this conflict really is, that no areas of the Holy Land are actually safe. And it shows you that the world war is really now, again, I mean, we've got northern Israel, the Golan Heights, all over Syria, Gaza. We've got all the terrorism going on within Iran. We've got the Turkish incursions in the region. We've got the Caucasus. We've got Russia, Ukraine. We've got all the things going on in Egypt and down by Somalia and Ethiopia. I mean, then the Sahel, which we're going to talk about later in the episode. I mean, this is it. World War III is now, everybody, and I think it's time that we realize that this strike on Iran that Israel is trying to goad the U.S. in is coming. And we see Vice President J.D. Vance giving his first interview after, accepting the nomination from the Republican Party at the behest of Donald Trump, that we need to strike back and strike Iran hard, no more messing around. We need to hit them hard if we're going to actually do something. And Netanyahu then comes and speaks in front of the American Congress, basically begging Biden and the Americans for more and more money to continue both the genocide in Gaza, but more importantly, to escalate the situation in the north in Lebanon, because we hear about a potential UAE on the ground, civilian Palestinian administration that has, Israeli military on the ground like in the West Bank, but has some kind of civilian government, not the Palestinian Authority, but the Israelis are trying to bring in the Emiratis to do that, as they are the greatest Muslim Shabbos goys in the region now. They've surpassed, the Saudis, they've surpassed the Turks, the Azeris, they're lurking in the shadows, giving Israel their energy, trying not to offend Big Brother Turkey, because we're going to talk about some of Erdogan's comments here in a second. But the fact of the matter is that Israel is about to escalate this into Lebanon, and while the non-Hezbollah factions in Lebanon are desperately trying to prevent this, the fact that the Islamic world is now still so united against Israel, I don't know if they're going to be able to quote-unquote resist, Hezbollah's call to war that is going to have to happen, because Hezbollah has said, and Nasrallah has made it very clear, that if Israel does what it's going to do and strikes across Lebanon and is quote-unquote proportional about their response to this strike on Majd al-Shams, then it's wartime. I mean, they literally said that it's time for an official declaration of war. So we're all awaiting that. And of course, Erdogan's comments were fascinating, Dimitri. I'm wondering if, unless you have anything else to say about what I just said, maybe we should go there.
Yeah, I think, look, Erdogan reacting and sort of responding to the fact that Israel is about to push its aggression onto Beirut. I think Erdogan very clearly remembers what happened in 2006 when Israel essentially blockaded Beirut. The conflict resulted in essentially the entire Levant being engulfed in war, and Turkey's interest being intimately, related to their region through trade, through, of course, pilgrimages that Muslims take, and to some of these holy areas, especially the Dome of the Rock and all these holy places. So, at least for the Islamic faith and even for the Christian faith, you can imagine the small minority groups within Turkey. It's Christian citizens who actually travel to Israel, Palestine. These are all interests of essentially the Turkish state. And so Erdogan has to essentially present himself as a strong figure who's willing to stand up to Zionist aggression. But in reality, Conrad, is it all rhetoric? Is it all PR? So his comments specifically, to quote, "We must be very strong so that Israel can't do ridiculous things to Palestine. Just like we entered Karabakh, just like we entered Libya, we might do similar to them." So, of course, Turkey was very much the historical, custodian, you can say, of the Holy Land after the fall of the Crusader states. And we know that various caliphates that control the areas essentially emerged under one rule of the Ottoman dynasty, which resulted in, of course, the Ottoman Islamic Caliphate, which, of course, controlled these areas for between 400 and 500 years after the fall of Constantinople very strongly. And this idea that Turkey has to control the Middle East and keep its peace rather than, say, the dynasty of Saud or some other weird Middle Eastern house, such as the one one in Jordan, which currently rules, and we spoke about that with Isaac, and these are very questionable sort of backgrounds that even these local kings have. Or even if they're not questionable, we understand that they're always answering to a bigger colonial imperial power from abroad. But nevertheless, I mean, Turkey has a really deep interest in this Levant region, and definitely Erdogan, just as he played his cards of the Ukraine-Russia war, of the grain deal, and being this peacemaker, perhaps this is more of like a peacemaker rhetoric talk that he's putting out there. And just as Russia in 2014 should have sent, peacekeeping detachments to Donbass and Donetsk, Lugansk to stop Ukrainian aggression, perhaps Erdogan will be forced to actually send Turkish troops now that he's withdrawn out of Syria and now that his relationship with Assad has improved, Conrad. And we know Damascus is being bombed right now. Like, it's being bombed every single week by Israel, essentially, or once every 2 weeks, like consistently. So Israel is at war still with Syria. And so Erdogan, Assad would allow perhaps a contingent of Turkish peacekeeping ground troops to move into Lebanon. And Israel definitely would not be striking Turkish troops. So as soon as the Turkish troops are positioned around Beirut, around some of these areas in order to keep the peace between two countries, we can hypothetically see a scenario, Conrad, in which Turkey actually plays this a peacekeeping partner, especially if it's a part of NATO. We do understand Article 5 still applies to Israel. Now, Israel is not a member of NATO, and here we get into like really crazy speculative talk, which we probably won't go into. But the other thing I wanted to mention was just the fact that Israel, like, its posturing is so aggressive. You noticed in the US, Netanyahu did fly over, did give that crazy speech in Congress, all the applause, the seal clapping, just disgusting, right? You had all the congressmen from various parties, even those who typically give off like anti-Israeli rhetoric. They stood up and clapped for this monster who killed all these
Oh
innocents.
yeah, I think at least a quarter of the hour that was spent for the speech was applause. And the only Republican that didn't show up was Thomas Massey, so
Yep.
respect to him, of course.
Yeah, just insane. And even after that, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security chief of Israel, like the really weird bug-eyed dude with glasses, right? The Chudjak, the evil Zionist Chudjak. Kamala says, she just tweets or sends out essentially this really plain message that, look, we need to look for peace because I'm the Democrat candidate and we're going to fix this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Ben-Gvir is like, no, I'm sorry, but that won't be necessary. Like, we'll take care of our own issues. He's already hand-waving her. He's like, okay, look, we're a patriarchal, ancient, Jewish, Hebrew society. We don't take, instructions from women. And it's just like, look, she's getting into the wrong. This Indian woman is not going to solve the issue if she's reelected as the president of the U.S. I think, and even Itamar Ben-Gvir kind of reveals that in his like ancient sort of Levantine misogyny, you can say, which in many ways is, I think, acceptable in this particular case. But you can kind of say like these people, it's like they're not interested in any of that, and even they're perhaps not even interested in Donald Trump's proposition. When Donald Trump, he's even, despite the fact that yes, Donald Trump is a Zionist in a light form, at least. But we do see Donald Trump, even when he met with Netanyahu, I think the emphasis was on peace rather than we will support Israel at all costs just to have Israel survive. I think nobody doubts Israel will survive because, look, the Arab countries don't look like they're going to invade and destroy Israel like in 1967 or, any of these wars that took place in the 20th century. It appears that Israel is strong enough to defend itself. The next question is, how do we sort of return to a peaceful coexistence between the Palestinian and Israeli people, which is what Donald Trump, I think, wants to achieve here, similar to how he wants to, I think, forge this really long-lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine. Frankly, even a short-lasting peace would be good. But yeah, so we have this really weird rhetoric from Ben-Gvir, and of course, Ben-Gvir is a really popular sort of character in the news, Conrad, because even recently, like, these news stories started coming out that Ben-Gvir was receiving footage from Hamas of hostages being tortured. And he's the national security chief, and Hamas is sending him like these USBs of torture footage because, they want to demoralize him. Like, this is his claim. It's just, the banality, and I just want to, there's some bad words I want to use, but the public perception that Israel is trying to, push forward here, that Hamas is this like evil organization, a lot worse than the IDF, a lot worse than Mossad, is really laughable at this point. But here we are. You're right, I think, completely in your analysis that the Druze will potentially be used as a catalyst to sort of push the cauldron over and kind of spill this war all over the Levant, cause massive issues, and of course a huge loss of life for the Lebanese people, who I think Israel is frankly happy to ethnically cleanse the south of Lebanon to potentially even take further territories, maybe create another like buffer state similar to the Sinai Peninsula. Who knows what like their long-term plans are for the region. It's probably quite diabolical. And speaking of diabolical, I don't want to say the Druze are like these great native people either, because the people are probably innocent in the Golan Heights, but the Druze religion itself, and this probably I mean, these people are pagans and they believe in Semitic Hamitic gods to begin with. I mean, the Israelis, right? These Talmudic idol worshippers, Baal, Moloch, etc. The Druze religion itself, I heard a Russian historian essentially describe the Druze religion as not even like a typical derivative of Islam. It's essentially like this ancient Satanism, if you can call it that. Like, it's a very Gnostic religion. So even the Druze religion itself is not harmless in and of itself. Like, they worship essentially demonic entities and demonic ideas of Gnosticism, duality, bogomilism, which we spoke about with Patrick on the, definitely check out that A for Hour episode when we spoke about magic and some of these heretical groups in the past. That's what Druidism is. So the fact that they use this group which believes in such falsehoods in order to push out a larger war, I think has some really, I mean, it's a bizarre analogy and parallel there. But in any case, yeah, definitely, we don't really see peace on the horizon in the Middle East. If anything, we'll see 2006 War 2.0 very soon.
No, I completely agree. And we have comments from Israeli foreign ministers that NATO needs to expel Turkey from the alliance due to Erdogan's recent comments about supposedly entering Israel, like you just said, Dimitri. And Israel Katz has also said, that's the Israeli foreign minister, that the only way to prevent a war between Hezbollah and Israel is for Hezbollah to withdraw north out of the southern Lebanon region, right on the Israeli border, where it has troops and where it has been launching strikes all over Israel and on its bases. So that means that pretty much war is inevitable because Hezbollah has said that they will never withdraw a single square inch of their current territory without a fight. So very, very escalatory times indeed. The situation, of course, in Turkey as well, between Turkey and Greece, is escalating because we talked about Cyprus, how Hezbollah warned Cyprus not to allow Israeli jets to refuel for their operations against Lebanon there, or else they are going to get roped into the conflict in the midst of other Greek and Turkish conflicts. Greece has attempted to acquire a lot of F-35s now from America, I think 20 that they're going to be getting, and I think it was Mitsotakis or one of the Greek politicians made comments that perhaps we will visit Turkey with F-35s, we will visit Ankara, implying that Greek pilots will do bombing runs on the capital of Turkey. And then, of course, I think Erdogan responded, 60 million tourists come to Turkey every year, so of course you're welcome to come. So obviously some, petty back and forth banter, but the fact is, these Hellenistic, Aegean conflicts are close enough to the Holy Land where the factionalism is gonna occur. And if Turkey gets kicked out of NATO, then strikes from Greece on Turkey within the context of NATO supporting Israel in this axis of resistance with the Muslim world versus, the NATO West, where, Greece then is able to strike Turkey because they're no longer, again, like Dimitri said, in the alliance and have Article 5 applying to them. And then you start to think about the fact that, well, we know the prophecies say that Russia will strike Turkey, and we know that certain aspects of the war will be very short, how like Turkish troops will withdraw from Cyprus, how they'll enter Crete, and then ultimately we know that in a very quick period of time, the Russians will be able to take Constantinople, perhaps. In this situation, Turkey withdraws from NATO, and the actual NATO alliance itself isn't the fault lines for the conflict, but it is sort of this post-NATO kind of Islamic, Caucasian, Turkic region and belt versus, other Christian societies that we've been talking about on the show. These are, alternative factionalisms and blocks that could develop that most people I don't think are actually looking at right now. But if you think about all angles, of course, religious, geopolitical, of course, economic with resources, if you factor in all of these things into the equation, then some of these political realities start to become clearer. So, of course, Dimitri, I'm curious as to your thoughts on a future post-Turkey NATO, as well as the potential for Cyprus, Greece, and these other countries to get dragged in, because I agree with what you're saying that the Druze are going to be used. Obviously, it's already happened. Gallant is calling them. It's the same as any Jewish boy or girl dying when these Druze people die. And like you said, many of them have Syrian passports. Immediately, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich were booed out of Majd al-Shams when they showed up to the city to pay their respects. And of course, you mentioned Ben-Gvir and his odiousness. I mean, he literally had a picture of Baruch Goldstein, the mass killer who, shot up women and children at a mosque in Israel for the Zionist cause in the 90s in his living room, like in his family's, living room. So this is an insane person, and the fact that Netanyahu is dependent on Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to keep his Likud government in power shows that it really can only be the devil behind the Zionist cause, because, that's more than just a deal with the devil. Netanyahu is already a bit of a devil himself, and then he's made deals with even worse devils to maintain this genocidal coalition that has been able to maintain the genocide in Gaza with no ceasefire, escalate the war in the north, all while maintaining power and not being held accountable for any of his, political crimes, as well as, his war crimes that he has committed now. So it's really just a terrible situation with the leadership in Israel. And again, I don't want war, but if war is inevitable, I hope to God that some of these people can get taken out. Like, would there be any better news than Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir killed in a Hezbollah airstrike? I mean, I hate to say it, but I don't want to, pray for anybody's death, but I think we're starting to get into a Julian the Apostate, St. Mercurius type situation here. One of the only direct things we have to report out of Gaza, this is just happening as we're recording, is there was another attack actually on the St. Porphyrios Orthodox Church, the third oldest church in the world, actually, the oldest Orthodox church in Gaza. The largest Orthodox church in Gaza, of course, Metropolitan Alexios of Gaza, is there under the Jerusalem Patriarchate. And this is a post from Patriarch Prime. He posted, in a new attack on St. Porphyrios Church in Gaza, the Zionists flew a missile into the church, and yet it miraculously did not explode. The missile was 155 millimeters, and he posted a UN infographic showing that the potential impact of such a missile would have pretty much demolished the entire church building. It would have disappeared if this warhead had actually exploded. So, super great blessings out of Gaza. St. Porphyrios Church itself still protected. We know that the church hall was demolished in a Zionist airstrike and killed dozens of people, including children, young children, the cousins of even former Congressman Justin Amash, an Antiochian Orthodox Christian here in America. So, horrible things, and the fact that the Zionists truly just don't care, if not are actively targeting Christian sites in their favorite areas for ethnic cleansing, which right now are Gaza, the West Bank, and southern Lebanon. We talked about how they targeted St. George Church in Hezbollah territory in Lebanon. We talk about how they target churches in East Jerusalem, and here they're targeting the historic St. Porphyrios Church once again, and only God himself is protecting the church from these explosions. So thank you, Lord, for protecting your church.
No, absolutely. And I mean, look, if a country like Turkey needs to get involved in order to calm some of these like hardcore Zionists down, I think definitely will call for it. And especially since there is no other country that is Christian or Muslim in the region that is willing to become involved. But yes, that interesting dichotomy between, of course, Turkey and the rest of NATO is very curious here, because Turkey is this weird, like it does have this strange neutrality to it. And you mentioned the fact that Turkey, what would happen if it actually left NATO? Well, I think for NATO itself, if you have a look on the map, the strength of NATO, Turkey being part of NATO, was because the US would station all these missiles there for the Cold War, especially nuclear missiles as well, that could launch from Turkey across the Black Sea and hit strategic targets across in the USSR during the Cold War. This was like the main consideration of having Anatolia as a part of this NATO coalition. But suddenly you have Sweden and you have Finland literally joining NATO, which is, I mean, insane that geopolitically and sort of foresight-wise, the Russian Federation allowed that to happen in the first place. I mean, this is crazy, but it happened now, and there's really no going back. But Kaliningrad is essentially surrounded at this point, and Russia has countries which are much closer to its borders, essentially, and these are large countries which essentially Turkey, the benefit of Turkey was that this strange like landmass you could position. It's very mountainous. You can position these missile launch sites essentially anywhere in Anatolia, and it'd be very hard for Russia to spot them without proper sort of satellite technology and drone scouting, things like that. But suddenly now Russia has this NATO contingent, these NATO bases up in the north in these various Scandinavian countries, which, I mean, this will cause a problem in the future. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is Turkey is not that must-have ally anymore in NATO, especially if it makes these strange Islamic sort of pushes against our greatest ally in Israel, right? So, I don't want to completely leave it out of the realm of possibility that Turkey could be expelled out of NATO for some sort of anti-Jewish actions in the Levant. But this interesting other actor comes into play here, because you mentioned Greece as well, and Greece has recently signed a letter of offer and acceptance from the US foreign military sale, and essentially has purchased 20 Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II aircrafts from Lockheed Martin and the United States. Their collaboration together, and these are F-35. So as you can imagine, we spoke about this on the last episode, where these are the stealth aircrafts, the very next generational. These are really some of the best fighter planes that you can actually get in the modern Air Force sense. And Greece actually bolstering its Air Force. You may think, well, what money is Greece using? Well, essentially Greece is just simply using credits. It's just basically utilizing Afterpay, utilizing a credit card in order to buy some of this really amazing technology, which potentially it will use. Like, without a doubt, these F-35s that Greece has just purchased will be used against Turkey in the coming war. And I think Greece just understands that as things escalate in the Eastern Mediterranean, it will surely become involved. And, unfortunately, the Greek government at the moment is completely occupied by some sort of gay Masonic lobby, probably which is NATO aligned, which is, I think, how we can describe it best. The majority of the Greek people, at least over 51%, are strongly practicing Orthodox Christians. So we do have to understand that, well, maybe these F-35s will be used to actually protect Greek sovereignty and the Greek people and not push some NATO agenda in the Mediterranean or over the Black Sea. Because as you can imagine, these F-35s, they fly fast and they fly far. They can get involved in Ukraine, in Russia, especially now that we see some of these conflicts ongoing. I doubt any of them will be actually donated to Ukraine. Ukrainian pilots are just getting used to flying the F-16s, which is a much older model at the moment. But yeah, just wanted to quickly mention Greece's debt, because it's like, well, what is Greece actually using to purchase these expensive Lockheed Martin planes? So the Greek debt to GDP ratio, if you look at the US's debt to GDP ratio, it's 123%, so quite radical, right? The US is, and Donald Trump even mentioned the national debt, right, in his RNC speech, that the US will move towards repaying it gradually. It's like, okay, right, something that's never going to happen, but, it still needs to be spoken about. But Greece is 162% of its of debt to national GDP. Like, the ratio is completely off. Greece will never ever repay this debt. It has to literally depend upon NATO, the EU, the entire fiat currency system to collapse around the world. The world economy needs to go into a World War III type phase for Greece to actually get away with this. And I think that's what it's banking on. It's just saying, look, we're just going to use this credit, we're going to use this debt we're just going to ignore it. We'll say we'll pay it off, and we'll just keep taking these credit cards and loans out. And I mean, in some ways, maybe it's just a cheeky Greek attitude to just get away with bolstering its military and just prepping. They're basically preppers with massive credit cards, and they're preparing for World War III. I think that's how I would look at it here. So yeah, I think there's always that angle, Conrad, of Greece and Turkey going at it in the future, not just via Navy but via Air Force, because you can see the difference in distance between Greece and Turkey is very much not far. Major Turkish military bases are essentially in reach of Greek aircrafts, and definitely, as we can see in the Lebanese-Israeli war, which is about to take place, the Air Force will be a major factor. So definitely the conflict, when it does escalate between these two countries and actually commences to take place and into more of just the rhetorical field, we're definitely going to see these F-35, these American Lockheed Martin planes be used, and hopefully for the benefit of Christian people.
Yeah, the F-35 will be able to outfly the F-16, and Greek pilots are the best pilots of any NATO country. They consistently win all of the contests. They consistently are the most popular pilots to have other countries that want to fly their planes and everything. So despite the fact that the Turkish army is much more powerful and larger than Greece, and their country is 10 times the size almost by population, the Greek Air Force is extremely powerful and should not be taken lightly by any Turkish revanchists or anything like that. And of course, we recently saw a Greek border guard shot from across the Turkish border. We don't know where the bullet came from. It could have been just a random criminal, it could have been a Turkish border guard, it could have been any number of persons, but the fact that this occurred obviously is just going to continue to increase tensions. We see the rhetoric increasing, unfortunately, like I said earlier, along the lines of this Israel-Palestine conflict. Of course, we see, unfortunately, certain Greek people, Serbian people, even other Orthodox people close to the Muslim world are sometimes, unfortunately, sympathetic to Israel because they kind of relate to the struggle against the Muslims. But I encourage those people to look into who was really behind, the Muslims oppressing you, and, like, who opened the gates to Constantinople, who is really behind, the Bosnian project and all of these kinds of things. I think it would benefit everybody to look into who's really doing that, so you don't, conflate Zionists and Jews as your friends just because they happen to also fight against Muslims. But I think we really need to move towards the Africa situation. There is a bit of ISIS resurgence going on in Syria and elsewhere, which is obviously being used by Israel and the United States to foment chaos in the region that is uniting against Israel under the Iranian Axis of Resistance banner. And of course, that's part of Turkey's commitment to this, why Erdogan has to keep up the rhetoric, because Hamas is ultimately kind of the Turkish wing of the resistance. They're the only real Sunni power actually standing up to Israel. They're the tip of the spear, of course, the ones enduring the genocide. They are Palestine, and the fact that they are the stars of the show right now means that Turkey has had to stand by them, and they have done that, of course, rhetorically at least. We've talked about the oil shipments, of course, the fact that they're standing with Azerbaijan and protecting the Azeri state-owned oil company from assault by protesters, because, of course, that company is selling insane amounts of energy to Israel at really reduced prices to support their war efforts. So all of that is going on, but we have to move to the Sahel region in Africa. Huge loss for the Wagner Group, or rather the new Wagner Group that is operating under the Russian army banner in the Sahel region, fighting in places like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. And this all, of course, took place in Mali recently. I think, Dimitri, you have the best details on what exactly occurred when this helicopter went down. The moderator of the Gray Zone, the main Wagner Group Telegram channel, was on this helicopter, or was rather in this group that was taken out by this insurgency, by this actually Ukrainian Western supported group in Mali. So please enlighten us to what occurred in the Sahel.
Yeah, so looking at the Sahel region at the moment, we can see that the state of Mali is looking to expand very deep into Islamic held territory. But unfortunately, this Islamic held territory is very much on a crossroads. There is not just one faction, but generally you can say three factions fighting amongst each other. And then the Malians, of course, enter into the fray. And as you can imagine, the Malians being very different, even ethnically, like looking at them, there's certainly, it's a mix between Berbers and sort of sub-Saharan Africans. So you have like people of really black and dark skin, like your typical Africans, as you can imagine. And you have these very lighter skinned Berbers, people of the Sahara, these nomadic people. And so this interaction is very much historic. And looking at this region now, you definitely have this African version of ISIS being involved here. You have the Azawad Tuareg movement, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is the most significant. These are the people who've actually dealt the blow, despite the fact that Al-Qaeda has claimed to have killed these Wagner troops and taken them prisoner. But it's definitely the Tuaregs who are probably the most sympathetic, I would say, people in this particular region. But we'll discuss how they're actually tied to Ukraine as well. And you have the actual Al-Qaeda, Jamaat Nasar al-Islam, very much Al-Qaeda-aligned forces in this region too. So the Malians are pushing into essentially no man's land. This is very, very dangerous territory. And again, we hear about all this like great stuff about Wagner acting overseas, and it seems very easy, but there's nothing easy about fighting in the Sahara in some of these towns where, I mean, it's very much Afghanistan type terrain. It's not mountainous, but there are these like sand dunes. The helicopter, mind you, the reason why when it crashed, Conrad, as it was flying towards one of these towns, scouting it essentially in the desert, was it was flying so low close to the ground in order to not be spotted from outside, that when the missile hit it, when I think it was probably like a heat-seeking missile shot from like a Stinger or something by one of these Tuareg or Al-Qaeda rebels, that the helicopter went down. Nobody actually died. There was a few injured Wagner troops, and then Wagner essentially formed what you can say is essentially like 19th century defensive position around the helicopter and around those survivors who crashed in it, and they resisted and they held off, but they didn't survive the night because, as you can imagine, in the Sahara Desert, the temperatures allegedly fall to sometimes negative 10 degrees Celsius. It gets very, very cold. And so the Russian troops there, along with some Malian allies, they were holding off for as long as they could, but they were surrounded. And when the Tuareg rebels actually surrounded them, they moved in, they killed close to 20. At least at this point, this is the numbers we're receiving from Northwest Africa, and they captured at least 15 Wagner troops, 14 of them. Several have already been handed over, so they're the Tuareg rebels, very interesting sort of group of people. These are not your typical Al-Qaeda, ISIS type Muslims. The Tuaregs are, I think the best analogy here, when I used to read about some of these various native groups fighting for independence, I think it's a bit wrong comparing them to Palestinians. These are sort of like the Herbert Walker, June, Fremen type people. These are the typical Berber nomads who were fighting firstly against the Islamic Caliphate expansion in the early centuries of the first millennium AD, but again, they resisted Islam for 300, 400 years, eventually converting to Islam, but retaining some of their sort of local customs, right? And then, of course, they fought against European colonialism for a very long time, and they also traded. They were big participants in the slave trade in Africa as well. These are very hardy sort of people, like literally local nomadic natives who were fighting against, you can say in a very like post-colonial sense, Conrad, they were fighting against big imperial powers for their entire existence for the last 1,000 years. And suddenly you have these Russians coming over with these black Malians, essentially trying to expand their interest of the Sahel alliance. And these people are not having any, they're just like the Taliban. They're just going to fight whoever comes to meet them. And so you had this clash of civilizations taking place in the desert. Unfortunately, a lot of the Russian troops have passed away due to this. And naturally, these Tuareg rebels, they're trying to build what they claim is an Azawad state. And, that they had their own fights of Al-Qaeda back in the day. But what's curious is, and this is the analogy to New Caledonia, Conrad, is that just like the New Caledonia natives received some sort of overseas funding and support from Azerbaijan, which is extremely bizarre because, thousands of kilometers removed, we have these Azawad Tuareg natives who simply are essentially the Kurds of Northwest Africa. They're receiving, it looks like, support from Ukraine. There are some Ukrainian flags flying. It's very bizarre, and it's almost as if, well, Ukraine has received these hundreds of billions of dollars of aid over the last 2 years. Perhaps some of the black market goods have actually went over to these Saharan rebels in the desert who are fighting against all kinds of forces. And you look, from the Tuareg perspective, they're literally the Kurds, so they're kind of stuck between all these major states: Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Libya, Algeria, Nigeria, Mauritania, and they've been denied statehood rights by the UN. I think it's the Kurds and the Tuareg people who are the only two nations who have applied officially on, I think, several occasions to the United Nations to be kind of treated similar to Palestinians, like, okay, we don't have a nation state, but maybe you guys can acknowledge us, and they were rejected. So these guys are, like, unfortunately, the reject natives of the world, and they're very triggered and upset. And their beliefs are very different to even the radical Wahhabis, Salafist sort of movements in the region. It's like very pagan. It's very matriarchal. And if you can think about Islam, very sort of patriarchal society, like women are sort of in this very ancient Middle Eastern way, shall we say, oppressed, right? But of course, we're not going to use this in like a feminist fashion, but women are not really taught how to read and write. There's all this weird obscuration happening with the hijabs, with all this Arabian culture is very much infused into Islam very strongly. But here in the Tuareg culture, it's the men who have to veil themselves in like a sort of sand mask. It's very much a Herbert Walker type June situation. I think it's a very interesting customs, like going back to the first millennia. And it's matriarchal. They have these legends of like an ancient Tuareg queen, which used to rule this Azawad state in the Sahara. And they want to go back to this particular tradition. And it's very interesting. And of course, their women are taught how to read and write, and they have been for hundreds of years. So it's very much it's a feminist type of matriarchal society that we're dealing with here. And I don't think the Wagner troops actually, unfortunately, even understood what they were doing in this region besides fighting radical Islamists, right? I'm sure they're being taught and briefed about what is happening, but at the same time, these areas are so intense and they're so varied in terms of enemies. I mean, it's highly dangerous, and the footage is crazy. I don't want to downplay this loss. This is a giant loss for not just Russian reputation, because now that Wagner is officially closer integrated to the Russian Federation, officially, Conrad, they lose this plausible deniability of saying, oh, well, these are just Prigozhin's like weirdo mercenaries, right? No, this is essentially an arm of Russian foreign policy being essentially slapped in the desert somewhere by these native Muslims. So it's very much humiliating and embarrassing for the Russian Federation, unfortunately, and it's an embarrassment for the Malian army as well, which frankly has been embarrassed for a little while by this radical Islamist for a long time now. But even worse is the footage that came out from the prisoners. So these Tuareg people are questioning the prisoners, and one of the prisoners, they come up to them and they say, okay, say all this stuff about Mali, say this stuff about Russia, and now say Allahu Akbar, and make all these Islamic proclamations. And of course, the prisoner, the Wagner prisoner, perhaps he is a pagan, perhaps he's not Orthodox, but he just starts repeating these essentially Muslim proclamations, and essentially which would equate to apostasy, right? From a Orthodox Christian, historical Orthodox tradition perspective, if you repeat some of these mantras of a pagan, a sort of foreign faith like Islam is, naturally this equates to apostasy. So it's not very good footage. It's quite demoralizing, but again, Wagner isn't very much known for its strong Orthodox Christian ethics and morals and values, right? They're very much people who need catechism. That's why they've only recently received their own sort of contingent of Orthodox Christian priests and chaplains who do assist them over time. So it's very much a work in progress. And, this is aligned as well with some of the rhetoric we've seen, some of the posts on social media, Conrad, where it's like, okay, the Wagner troops have went to Valhalla. I mean, I get it. It sounds really cool, but Valhalla is not a real place. I mean, I completely understand. I acknowledge the fact that these are Russian brave troops who've died, but perhaps we should considering the fact that 2 days ago, prior to this recording, we celebrated the feast of Saint Vladimir of Kiev, who baptized Rus. I think it's time to embrace Orthodox Christianity a bit more and perhaps use some of these symbols of the faith and perhaps this would even assist us in the battles which the Wagner and the Russian troops face overseas in these foreign lands, in these dangerous operations in which they may all be killed. And, so this particular loss of Russian troops, I mean, it's horrific, it's horrendous, but then again, these are some of the most dangerous places on the planet. It's very much a Black Hawk Down Somali type operation when the US lost many of its troops in what seemed to be a foreign operation which it didn't need to be involved in. And I'm sure some Russians at home are questioning as to, okay, what are we actually doing in the Sahel Alliance region? And they won't be receiving answers because this is essentially a black ops type operation. It's a very long term planned Russian assistance of its Sahel allies in the region. And so the risks are definitely there, and so is the plausible deniability. We're not sure if these people will be receiving pensions, if they'll be receiving any sort of compensation, right? Given that they are still mercenaries, it's very risky. And I mean, these people are adventurers, they're heroes, they're sort of the heroes of the modern Iliad story that we read about in the Donetsk, Lugansk. It's the modern Wagner troops. So I think it comes with its pros and it comes with its cons.
No, I agree. It was really a crazy situation. It wasn't exactly a story I was expecting when it came out of the blue, but we have reports now from Wagner aligned Telegram channels. They're saying that the PMC is sending large reinforcements to Mali from Russia, Syria, and the Central African Republic, which are pretty much the three countries where most of Wagner would be able to come from if they came from anywhere. So it seems that they're perhaps taking this personally, and view their reputation on the line and are going to try to then strike back 3 times as hard and perhaps make up for whatever they perceive as this loss, both optically and, strategically on the ground. But the other situation, of course, you mentioned the Ukrainian help. We see white Ukrainian Slavs on the ground with these Tuareg rebels, with some of these Al-Qaeda affiliates even, which we talked about the ISIS-Ukraine connection in the past already. So no surprise there. Of course, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, all of these other Islamic, extremist cults are pretty much active across all of Bantu Africa, all the way even out to Somalia and some of East Africa. So it's no surprise that ISIS has its own enclaves in Mali, obviously. But I think the fact that the Ukrainians are operating here proves that, again, we know that Ukraine is going to be trying to hurt Russia however they can, but it's become obvious that the Ukrainian project is now this nexus, it's this home base for NATO and the Atlanticist bloc to wage its world war against Russia. I mean, what would some Ukrainian operative with, Western weapons, how do you think he got to the Sahel region? Who do you think is the interested party in actually disrupting Wagner's operations there? Obviously, it's like the French and ostensibly, the United States and the UK. So this is obvious that this isn't a real Russia-Ukraine proxy war. This is just the Third World War and one of its many proxies, being fought at multiple levels of proxy shielding, Ukraine, rather the West masking as Ukraine, masking as Tuareg. It gets very deep, but it would make sense for true fifth generation, World War III, for this to be that complex when it comes to the diplomacy, when it comes to the espionage, when it comes to the legality of all of these black operations and legitimacy that each force needs to have when they are on the ground in these countries. It all has to come together, and that's why these intelligence agencies are such massive bureaucracies, because you need that level of organization and institution to make, to pull together this web that this Third World War is becoming. But unless you have anything else to say about Sahel, we probably need to talk about the situation in East Africa, because Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, all of that is accelerating. Of course, the Russians have pretty much officially switched to supporting the Sudanese government against the rapid support forces in Sudan, who are taking massive amounts of territory. Of course, I believe the Sudanese government has agreed to give Russia its base on the Red Sea. And speaking of bases on the Red Sea, we heard Somalia categorically tell Ethiopia that they will never be able to have access to the Red Sea as long as they have any say about it. So that pretty much solidified Ethiopia's support for the separatists in Somaliland. It appears that Turkey's kind of incursion into Mogadishu and the Somalian, government isn't really going to pan out, and Ethiopia is now aligned against Turkey because Turkey is a strong supporter of the central government in Somalia and are even going to send troops there to help put down the Somaliland and Puntland separatists that are dominating in the northern, more peaceful parts of the country where they are less racked with Islamic extremism. But thinking about how this is going to shape up, of course, we know about Ethiopia and Egypt's problems with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and Egypt's issues on the Nile. But thinking about the factionalism here, we know that Turkey and Russia, are destined to clash with each other, and Ethiopia, while they are Monophysites, their historical Christianity and ties with Russia are notable. They are probably the most recent Christian monarchy to fall to communists, the only real relevant one to fall after Tsar Nicholas II himself. So there are really a lot of grand narrative civilizational parallels between the two nations. I've always said that we could see a future in this sort of prophetic World War III that is playing out, and how each side is getting decided. We could see Ethiopia return to orthodoxy, even if certain things align with them, allying with Russia against Turkey, which appears to be happening with their now crisis with Somalia. So A lot of interesting developments there. But unless you have anything else to say about Africa, Dmitry, we do need to talk about Russia, Ukraine itself, and how it seems that for the first time, the Russians are kind of saying, whatever, we don't really want to negotiate. We're going to keep advancing. And Zelensky is like, no, no, we want to negotiate, which is a huge sea change compared to the last, 3 years.
Yeah, of course. What's interesting is the foreign minister of Ukraine for the first time has actually left Ukraine and started speaking about peace in a very in negotiatory fashion, and not to just some U.S. or Western power, but to a country in a country which really hasn't been supporting Ukraine in a strong fashion, like it has been calling for peace, and that's Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, which of course it's Dmitry Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, has visited China and spoken to Xi Jinping and some of the other people in China there, and he basically said that he restated that Kiev is ready to engage the Russian side in a negotiation process at a certain stage when Russia is ready to negotiate in good faith, but emphasizing that no such readiness is currently being observed on the Russian side. So again, it appears that Russia is, it's quite content with its progress in the various regions of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye. The fact that Russia is not retreating and really hasn't retreated since some of those Ukrainian, like, very minor territorial gains in July, August of last year during its massive counter military operation, whatever that waste of tanks and armament was in the middle of last year. But Russia is very much in a comfortable position as Western economies are sort of still finding their bearings during this massive recession, and the fact that the economic situation is quite shaky at the moment, and there are these massive bubbles being formed in a lot of these fiat economies in the West. I think everyone's very scared of actually giving tens of billions more to Ukraine. But at the same time, you do have these strange powers, I think, forming in Europe. And by strange, I mean, it's strange that they support Ukraine so unequivocally, despite their own countries suffering from domestic issues like all this like migrant and Islamic terror and in the UK. And still we have somebody like Boris Johnson actively being hawkish. It's almost in a weird type fashion. Like now that Donald Trump, JD Vance are in very much Ukraine skeptics, you can say, suddenly you have Boris Johnson and all these United Kingdom politicians pushing for more Ukrainian aid from NATO. Like, it's very strange why this particular gap is being filled by these European politicians who should be concerned of this conflict essentially spilling out into their own countries, which are fairly close to Ukraine border and geography-wise, which, frankly, they're going to be the ones at risk if this escalates into a third world war, less than the United States is. So why are they pushing for more war? I mean, it's only suicidal, perhaps, because by ethnicity and by religion, a lot of these people like Keir Starmer actually do not belong to the native people of the countries which they represent, if you really think about it deeply. And even Germany's 2025 budget, has been announced, and it will literally have a small sliver, a section dedicated to Ukraine, Conrad. So Germany, which is currently starving it's going through a massive energy crisis, it has been for the last 2 years. Russian gas, the Nord Stream 1, 2, the complete failures, the sabotage which has been pushed upon Germany, the Russo-German relationship has been essentially destroyed economically speaking. France is essentially sending energy to Germany, which is really weird. So Germany, which has always been not energy independent, but has been using countries like Russia and the USSR for, when this is while Germany was still split, in order to bolster its massive industry and technological growth post World War II. It has been utilizing external energy. Suddenly, the elites, the globalists, have informed Germans that no, you cannot sort of progress your industry any longer. You must return to essentially the Stone Age, the 1950s again, right? Which is, I think, really concerning and possibly has some deeper roots. Maybe it's the anti-European nature of the regime that runs this global agenda, Conrad, that they want to essentially, for lack of a better term, keep the white man down, right? The Central European, potentially the opposition parties rising in Germany, these do form some sort of risks for a rising conservative right-wing Central European power. And the best way for a wrench into that equation is simply to spoil their relations with other countries and just make the German people poorer overall, which is exactly what's happening with skyrocketing energy prices. So definitely Germany, Scholz is looking like a very weak chancellor, very weak leader of Germany. So, and him, Keir Starmer, it's very much like these strange, weak hawks. Almost, I wouldn't even say hawks. This is a different type of bird. It's more like an angry, demented rooster of some sort, right? And I don't mean the rooster of Caparot. This is like a very strange sort of creature that we see in Western and Central Europe. But The reason I mention this is that Kuleba is clearly stating, and you even see Arestovich, right? This is the main opposition leader to Zelensky. Every single interview Arestovich is giving, and Arestovich is that pickup artist who is very popular in Ukraine online, and he used to be Zelensky's advisor. He's clearly openly stating, Conrad, that he will bring peace to Ukraine if he's re-elected, but Zelensky is not going to run any elections. And if Arestovich returns to Ukraine, there's a chance he's assassinated, like that recent right-wing woman who was killed by even further Ukrainian right-wing nationalists. And it's really concerning because Ukraine is descending down this funnel of radicalism inside of itself, like into this Petlurism, into this militia divisions within the country. There is no unity, and naturally you can see this in church politics, which we'll discuss at the end. Even its alleged Ukrainian schismatic orthodoxy is breaking apart at the seams with various co-services with the Uniates and random Catholics. The country is in a lot of turmoil at the moment. And peace, definitely, Russia is waiting for Ukraine to submit to. I mean, Putin has already given the ultimatum of peace, Conrad. It's just the fact that, look, Ukraine is not willing to give up Zaporozhye, Kherson, and all these constitutionally Russian territories. And at the same time, the last comment I wanted to make was Mike Pompeo, our favorite schism supporter, has come out and stated that, look, he's had some intel from the new Donald Trump inside info that when Donald Trump does come into power, there'll be at least like 40 plus billion annually dedicated to Ukraine in terms of foreign aid. So Ukrainian support is guaranteed. And this degenerate of a man, this man who has essentially flamed this conflict and flamed schism and flamed this entire Eastern European World War III theater, is now telling us that the US will be giving just as much as it is giving to Israel annually. It will now be also giving the same amount to the Ukraine. So yes, the enemies are definitely working, and the hawks are working overtime in this particular region.
No, I couldn't agree more. And again, we obviously are keeping our eyes on Ukraine, but the situation at this point seems that Russia is just going to slowly but surely actually gain control over as much territory as it can until, I guess, they get the Ukrainians to the point where they think when they do come to the table, they're already going to be willing to give them whatever they want, which, again, that's better than going and actually being willing to give things up at the negotiating table. I don't think that that's something that they need to be doing right now. I would think that that would be kind of a slap in the face to all of the people that supported you in your homeland, as well as the troops on the ground, and the fact that you've have people in Wagner in Russia, in Africa even, doing these things, sort of following this vision of Russia fighting back against the globalists and actually establishing a situation that is profitable on the ground for the people of Donbass, right? But we have to move away from Eastern Europe at this point and move squarely into the demonic world of the Paris Olympics. Of course, we saw France, hosting the Olympics, the Olympic Games, in their city of love, the African city itself, Paris, and the French African capital of the former glorious empire. And the fact of the matter is, besides just the blasphemy, of course, we're going to talk about, and I don't know what else there is for us to really say, but the fact of the matter but of course, everybody saw the demonic Last Supper representation with the fat, tranny drag queen people, all of these, queer type characters, blaspheming everything, shoving it in our faces, proving that, Islamic society and, sort of the third world is more sane than any Western nation when it comes to this insane sexual degeneracy and this, worship of the other and diversity and all of this nonsense. So obviously there's all of that, but in more straight up news, during the opening ceremonies in the very beginning of the games, the northern part of France's high-speed rail network was completely disabled by sabotage, which apparently was arson at stations and on tracks and at these centers that would keep the trains running and everything. So there were huge delays. People weren't able to get where they needed to go all over the north of France. And apparently there was attempts in the south that were prevented. And I don't know who is going to be blamed for this. It appears that people are already setting the stage to blame Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, or something like that. But I really don't have a huge idea of who it could be. Maybe Azerbaijan, I'm not sure, because we recently saw France give a huge amount of weapons to Armenia. In fact, Armenia is gaining some of the largest amounts of weapons in the region in general, and the Azerbaijani defense ministry has directly accused the EU and France of arming Armenia for a future war. They say that these huge acquisitions of hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons and drones and air defenses and even tanks and stuff like this is going to basically dramatically escalate, lead to arms races in the region, and that, of course, Azerbaijan says they're never going to give up Karabakh or any of these regions, of course, that Erdogan mentioned. I think it's funny that he called we will, and just like we entered Karabakh, referring to the Azeri troops as one with the Turkish troops. Of course, the ethnic ties run very deep, but I think the fact that France is so heavily investing with Armenia, obviously that's pushing Russia out of the Armenian camp, but at the same time, Iran is going to build a base in Armenia. So Armenia kind of getting the best of both worlds right now. Huge amounts of Western weapons and a huge Iranian base to also protect you from the Azeri menace. So, and then you talked about, before we leave Eastern Europe entirely, I do want to mention what happened with Hungary and with Orban. Of course, recently Orban made comments that the Poles allegedly conduct business quietly with Russian companies through intermediaries, and the Poles are all very offended by this. And the deputy foreign minister, he actually called on Orban and Hungary to leave the EU and NATO and enter a union with Russia. And, they're kind of getting really offended and saying that, why are you even in this alliance if you're just going to sabotage us and want to work with Russia? But now there's even chatter that, like was heard at the very beginning of the special military operation, that, the Poles and the Slovaks and the Hungarians, they're getting very, very sick and tired of, the Ukrainians and how they're doing things on their border, how they're recruiting people to the military and sending them to the front lines from, those ethnic groups, Slovaks, Hungarians, Romanians, these kinds of things. And there's also thousands of people every day swimming across the rivers to the border to escape conscription and being sent to the front lines. So there's more and more talk that the Russians are going to allow the Poles, the Hungarians, the Slovaks even to enter into Western Ukraine and start to retake some territory for themselves, which I think would be quite a fascinating development. But the fact of the matter is that Orban should stay in NATO as long as possible to frankly help the rest of Western Europe. But if it does come a point where they're going to get expelled, perhaps Hungary and Turkey will get expelled from NATO in one go, which would be a very interesting development in the factionalism and the sides and the future Wikipedia box that we'll be able to read when it comes to World War III. But Dimitri, I would love your thoughts on the demonic Olympics as well as the situation in the Caucasus and Western Europe in general.
Yeah, I mean, the Olympics was a giant embarrassment for France, and I think it was not only just the public humiliation ritual, it was also a slap in the face to the French people who have been occupied by essentially a Masonic, you can just openly call it like a Judeo-Masonic cabal, which has ruled it for at least 200 years now since they beheaded King Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette, and essentially in what can only be described as Roman Catholic martyrdom with the guillotine during the French Revolution. And Napoleon, of course, was not a main oppositionary leader to this movement in any case, because he did form the Grand Sanhedrin and he gave Jews all these bizarre rights across the French Empire, which existed at that point. It's just the entire thing was just satanic, even in that early 19th century. But here we have almost the progression of that, Conrad. France is one of the first liberal, revolutionary, Enlightenment countries on the European continent, essentially, despite the fact that it was one of the first Orthodox Christian independent nations in Europe under the Merovingian dynasty back in the day, which was separate from the Roman Empire. Still, France has descended at this point, 1,500 years later, into the state of almost complete debauchery. I mean, you can just imagine even the parklands. Like, there's such a variety of degeneracy in France that the Olympics kind of it had all of that. It had the dirty River Sion. It had the Bois de Boulogne sort of park, which is infested with transgenders, and this has been going on since like the 1990s, right? You had this like park of sexual degenerates running around, having all kinds of weird mutant type characters, right? In these particular places, now you have mass immigration, and those sort of African American looking people were represented in this show of debauchery and degeneracy during the Olympic opening ceremony. So France is very much multicultural, it's very much multi-gendered, and it's very degenerate as shown in this ceremony. And in reality, I think there is a deeper France which is still Christian, still Roman Catholic, maybe a very small minority still Orthodox Christian, holding on to those roots which were planted there by very ancient Roman and even, I would say, saints from like the early centuries, like Mary Magdalene, etc. But unfortunately, the oppression of the Antichrist forces is so strong that these people are just not being heard. And Macron said, Macron was very proud of what took place this past weekend, and nevertheless, I think the world is looking in awe and shock, because we've never had a nation embarrassed in such a capacity so publicly. It's almost like the first time, Conrad, where something this disgusting has been portrayed with almost no remorse whatsoever. In fact, they're going to double down, and this particular fellow who organized the entire thing, very, so shall we say, Jewish-looking man, Thomas Joly, right? And some people are saying, well, he doesn't look Jewish, he looks Gaelic. Well, regardless of the fact, the act itself is very much Talmudic, right? We do know that Talmud promotes various other genders, degeneracies, and all these deviant type separations of God's creation into elements. I mean, we spoke about this on several of our 8 hour shows. Essentially, what we have is not ancient Judaism. This is a religion which is very pagan, very much its roots going back to the Old Testament, and into some of these apostasaic movements that the righteous Israelites actually accidentally or even intentionally fell into via their communication with neighboring tribes and peoples. And so, what we have here in France is essentially a show of that cultural dominance, Conrad, this triumph of Talmudism, this triumph of Freemasonry, and essentially embarrassing the French people to such an extent that I'm not even sure if they'll be able to recover without maybe even a second French Revolution, like a conservative one. Because at this point, the immigrant crisis, the fact that the French people the protests don't work. Remember the Yellow Jacket protest. There's nothing that the people can do in order to stop the circus and the Talmudic roller coaster from rolling onwards, and even France's geopolitical losses. Think about it. Northwest Africa completely failed. Support for Ukraine, completely failed project. Macron's sort of rhetoric, Napoleon 2.0, who's married to his high school teacher and is a Rothschild banker. Like, think about it. The entire thing is a disaster. And these Olympics, I mean, the fact that collective sport in general and the Olympics are very questionable to begin with, because they are deeply Masonic, if you think about it. And I'm not saying that some of the Olympic Games weren't great in the past, so that sport is bad, but the early 20th century, the way it pushed Olympics onto the world stage and even had the Russian Empire become involved in it, was very much to promote this idea of a United Nations, of this globalist sort of power structure. We know the Olympics were banned for this exact reason by St. Theodosius the Great in the late 4th century, the Roman emperor saint, when the original Olympics, which were very deeply pagan, and I think we're returning to that pagan standard. So hopefully either St. John Vitatsis, when he awakens, or the future Russian Orthodox Tsar of Russia, who is elected, will essentially ban the Olympics again, because it's really turning into this new Eurovision degeneracy fest, which I think no Christian should partake in. And a lot of Orthodox Christians, not just hierarchs, but also sportsmen, have openly spoken out against what they witnessed in France this week.
Yeah, we're not seeing the sights like you saw in 1936, when maybe it was a bit of more of a respectable institution, right? But no, I'm joking, of course. I agree. The Olympics should be banned. It's gay, globalism, it's pagan. Maybe you can replace it with some kind of international games that's, from a different foundation, but the International Olympic Committee is almost like its own United Nations. Why are they so relevant when it comes to deciding if Russia can even fly its own flag? I mean, look, you've got Israel there actively committing a genocide, but the Russian athletes aren't allowed to fly the Russian flag. It's totally ridiculous. I mean, even the Azeris were flying their flag in France. Like, the French didn't even mandate anything with there. They let their number one op, roll right in. But I think we got to move on a little bit. We're getting close on time here. I'm going to cover a few quick stories, specifically this election going on in Venezuela as we speak. Huge protests are erupting across the nation of Venezuela against Nicolas Maduro. Of course, it was initially shown that in the presidential election, he was destroyed in all regions of Venezuela. He lost, but after some, magic was done by the Electoral Commission, he magically won with 51% of the vote. And I'm not saying that all of the initial count was correct. Obviously, Maduro has been under pressure for sort of a soft color revolution for basically his entire reign since he overtook Hugo Chavez in 2013 as president of Venezuela. But the fact of the matter is that he's doubling down. He's going to stay in power, and all of South America is basically having to make a choice. And of course, Milei, the presidents of Peru, all sorts of these countries that are more aligned against the Chavist Bolivarian side of things are saying, we will not recognize Maduro, we will not, support his government, we're going to withdraw our ambassadors and everything. They recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as the real president. Of course, the real candidate was Maria Corina Machado, who was ultimately barred from running for supposed corruption charges, which was widely viewed as sort of just political repression on the behest of the Maduro regime. But she got Edmundo Gonzalez to run in her place, and he, of course, won. Obviously, I'm honest enough to admit that even beyond the multipolar implications and the fact that Maduro is obviously pro-Russia, pro-China, pro-Cuba, he's going to face immense pressure from the US, UK, Atlantic Zog machine. There's no denying that the people in Venezuela are going to want to elect somebody else. It's horrible there. It didn't matter how based or whatever you were, even if it wasn't your fault, even if Maduro was blameless in all of this, it would still make perfect sense why he would get voted out. And he's not blameless. He's probably a total piece of garbage. So I really have no interest in actually defending him. However, anyone that takes power from the Venezuelan opposition is going to be horrible as well. I have no illusions that those people are based. They're horrible, secularist, capitalist, Atlanticist nonsense retards. Like, they're basically like Milei, but nowhere near as interesting, and less radical to where they probably won't even abolish, the federal bank and really just go back to a totally normal fractional reserve banking system and just totally incorporate Venezuela and its vast oil reserves into, the current system that operates control with the petrodollar and is no longer a thorn in their side that occasionally trains militias to go do things overseas or allows Russia into its territory like Cuba does, right? So we're witnessing that. Obviously, I think Maduro is going to hold on, but who knows? That may not be true. He's clearly going to face some of the hardest pressure he's faced in a while. But most people are also pretty honest about the fact that the Venezuelan opposition are huge cowards, and the protests we're seeing right now are actually organic. There's not going to be a huge militarized opposition where a real color revolution could take place because I think many of them are too afraid. But perhaps the U.S., will work its magic, and this will be one of the few ones where I'm not too attached to Maduro to be that affected to see him go. But there's big protests in Bangladesh as well. I don't know all the details, but they are student protests. I think over 200 people have died now. People are getting blinded by tear gas canisters, pepper balls, all these sorts of things. So big things going on there. But I think we got to move on to talk about some of these church things. A lot of things going on in the church this past week. Of course, I think we should actually start with the Metropolitan Hilarion stuff, and then we can talk about Esfigmenou and some of these other things. But Dimitri, maybe you can fill the people in on this situation with Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, who's been accused of some pretty gross moral crimes and has been suspended from duty by the Synod and the Moscow Patriarchate as an investigation is ongoing. So obviously we knew about this a little bit before it became really public. I saw the first posts about it from Nexta, which obviously is a very anti-Russian source, but there's no denying that. I mean, even just some of the pictures alone that have been posted. Why is this, this subdeacon, this little Asian boy, is in bed and Metropolitan Hilarion's like laying on him on the computer. I mean, this is some pretty terrible stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Metropolitan Ilarion Alfeyev, he's one of the more educated Russian Orthodox bishops. Not just, I mean, his wisdom to age ratio is very much, very, very high. So if you think about it, he is Oxford educated. He does have several degrees. He's a gifted musician. I think he can play several musical instruments, knows multiple languages. He's just a very gifted lad. I think somebody claimed that he's at least half or like a quarter Jewish, which gives him that like Ashkenazi IQ boost or something. But I'm not even sure if that's irrelevant or even brought to anything. This was just a rumor back in the day, which a lot of conservative Russians were pushing, given the fact that he was promoting ecumenism back in the early days, which a lot of Russian bishops were, frankly, and even Patriarch Kirill was slightly involved in those sort of things back in the day, but thus he has changed. He's more like a Metropolitan Tikhon at this point. And Metropolitan Alfeyev as well has changed, despite the fact that, he still holds on to a lot of these liberal beliefs. But these rumors, Conrad, just briefly going over them, they're quite disgusting. I don't think it's worth like voicing them, but definitely they're of a sexual type nature, which has, this is not the first time in church history when you had hierarchs, monastics essentially engage in this sort of thing. And this is like a big deal in the Roman Catholic Church. But if you can imagine, wherever there is celibacy, there is also the demons of lust. And even in their most perverse forms, they always reside, and they work on the feelings and the emotions of people. And who knows what kind of battles various monastics around the world are facing, whether it be men or women. So these particular spiritual battles, which I'm not even qualified to speak on, but you do read about them in the lives of saints, and they're quite drastic. And I'm not saying Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev has engaged in those sort of battles, but he's always been a little bit, a little bit on the more left wing side, which does not mean he accepts these sort of things. But he was acceptive of, say, the COVID vaccine. He was against the SMO, which is probably why he was sent to Hungary, Budapest in the first place. But nevertheless, I've seen some remarks from Russian hierarchs, even Russian priests, Conrad, popular ones online, who've commented on this, and so some of them are even pro Metropolitan Hilarion, like their friends, they've known him, and they're saying that, well, potentially these are deep fakes. They're saying that it needs to be investigated, and it will be investigated by the Russian Synod, and before anything is carried out. The only reason he's suspended is so that the scandal isn't sort of propagated further, because again, the West will use this against the Russian Orthodox Church, as you can imagine. Hungary, Budapest, we understand Orban is in control, but it's still a NATO country. And these particular instances, these scandals will be used against the Orthodox Church if immediate sort of interim action isn't taken, which is what the suspension is. It's just an interim suspension of his practicing bishop license. And he can just be a monastic in peace if he's innocent. And in fact, if you're innocent and you're persecuted in the Orthodox Church, you're essentially an icon of Christ, and you're repeating the works of those saints who are also persecuted like Christ for for essentially doing nothing wrong and committing no crime. So that's not actually a bad thing for him. It's in any case, it's a win-win. He'll be investigated, found guilty or charged, and in many ways he'll get to better himself and probably even move through whatever horrific crimes he had committed if he did commit them. But we do see another bishop, Conrad, getting defrocked in that same ruling. This bishop was not just defrocked, but just completely removed from the Orthodox Church, excommunicated, defrocked. But this is not for any sexual related scandals. This was the Metropolitan Ignatius of Viborg. He was the head of the Viborg diocese for 10 years between 2013 and 2023, and he was defrauding his entire diocese. This is proven. There are he was working with the accounts of the diocese to funnel and steal money from his own people. This is crazy. And the Russian Orthodox Church during 2013, 2023, you can imagine all the donations coming into the church, and this bishop was literally just taking gibs and just stealing from Orthodox Christians. I mean, this is just it's just evil. So completely defrocked and removed from power. So the church does act, and it does cleanse itself of these bad shepherds on occasion who make their way into the city of God, you can almost say. And but by the way, the other thing about Metropolitan Alfiev, real quick, Metropolitan Hilarion openly proclaims his innocence. That's one. So he's not pleading guilty or anything. And two, he's also stating that he's being blackmailed. So he's saying no relations took place, and he's being blackmailed by either the mother of this Asian boy that's involved or something like that. It's really bizarre, and it's extremely concerning. And hopefully the Diocese of Budapest, the Russian Orthodox Diocese of Budapest, without the administrative skill of Metropolitan Alfiev, will do fine, because as we can imagine, their shepherd is going to be on hold for a little while. What will happen? Will there be any sort of handover from him to another temporary bishop? Will church affairs go sort of unadministered for a little while in that diocese? That could cause local problems as well. Lots of different church-wise concerns in that particular area, but probably the biggest stories, I would say, church-wise in recent weeks, despite despite the weird stuff that always takes place in Ukraine, which I guess we can discuss in a little bit. Briefly, in Ukraine, Conrad, right? Well, what did we see? The most scandalous thing, and this, it's been a great week because we haven't had any footage of any churches being raided, monasteries being harassed, any priests being having their houses broken into. We've had strange occurrences. For example, the hill on which the Church of the Tibes once stood in the ancient Dormition Cathedral, which Saint Vladimir of Kiev actually himself built. This is a 1,000-year-old place dedicated to Christ in Kiev, Ukraine. Just about a week ago, there was a pagan ceremony to the pagan Slavic god Perun carried out by local, I guess you can call them Banderite, weird Ukrainian pagans on this hill, or where the Church of the Tibes once stood, which Zelensky destroyed at night. So you can imagine the Mayor Klitschko, the former boxing champion, the mayor of Kiev, is now pushing paganism in his own particular city, definitely humiliating Orthodox Christians. And mind you, the celebration of Perun, and anyone who's neo-pagan listening to this, if you read about ancient Slavic religion and this particular paganism in Slavic culture, Perun could only be venerated and worshipped by the elites of Russian Slavic society. So we're talking about the prince. Typically, the Russian Slavic society did not have any shamans or volkhs, as they called them. They didn't have any priests, and it was the prince or the knyaz of the time who actually needed to personally speak to Perun privately in his sort of priestly chambers of some sort. So the role of the priest and the king, or the local king, the prince, was very much aligned in that particular culture. The common, dirty, weird Ukrainian neo-pagan druid, which is a role that didn't exist, could not invoke Perun on top of a hill. The common person, people forget that ancient Indo-European Aryan societies were hierarchical. They think they were all, just a common person could even pray to this ancient god. So what I'm trying to say is the entire thing is LARP. And not only is it LARP, but it's definitely some sort of KGB, SBU form of humiliating the Orthodox Church even further. And naturally, just regarding the UOC, Conrad, just really briefly, the UOC is currently under attack. One of the most active bishops of the Ukrainian schismatic church under Epiphany Metropolitan, Alexander Drabinko, false Metropolitan, he has openly stated that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the reason why it isn't banned is because they're formulating a deal and they're mediating with the Ukrainian government in order to separate and schism away from Moscow and join the EP. He's saying Metropolitan Onufri wants to join the EP, which there's no way, that's going to happen. But this is what the second in charge of the schismatic church in Ukraine is pushing, whilst at the same time, literally yesterday, this false Metropolitan Alexander co-served for Saint Panteleimon Moleben, a very short service in church in a Roman Catholic cathedral. So he's co-serving with Uniates whilst trash talking Metropolitan Onufri and essentially attacking the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical one. Horrible. This Alexander Drabinko guy, he is one of the most dangerous, wolves in sheep's clothing that we have in Ukraine at the moment. One of the reasons was because he was the right wing bishop, the main assistant of Metropolitan Vladimir, the predecessor of Metropolitan Onufri. So he knows the inner workings for 10 years, his entire 30s. This young priest, monk, archimandrite, and then, of course, a young bishop was working inside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church administration. He knows the ins and outs. He knows how to manipulate the system, and now is using that essentially like a Judas Iscariot type figure against the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. I mean, you think about St. John Chrysostom when he says, the robes of the vestments and robes of bishops, they sort of paved the way to hell. We're talking about the robes of men such as this Alexander Drabinko, very evil type of character. So definitely a lot going on in Eastern Europe in church wise, but definitely there's still hope as long as Orthodox Christians stay true to their faith.
Totally, of course. And I know sometimes we report bad news in the church, but we only do so to get the prayers of our audience so that such things can be remedied and so that people are actually not scandalized if perhaps non-believers or people trying to defame the church bring these to your attention, because I can assure you that nothing we're going to talk about on the show is ever like, we are leaving the Orthodox Church because of this. We will never leave the Orthodox Church. There will never be a scandal in the Orthodox Church that somehow compromises her Catholicity or her apostolicity or the fact that she is the pillar and ground of truth, right? But I think even the Metropolitan Hilarion example shows that at an institutional level, the Orthodox Church is better about this than, for example, the Roman Catholics. I mean, for many years, Metropolitan Hilarion was thought to be the understood successor to Patriarch Kirill, but before these accusations even came out, I think he was sussed out as somebody that was not Patriarch material and was promptly sent to Hungary. I think that's in no small part due to his nonsense position on the vaccine, that people who don't get it need to repent, which is very silly. However, there's no denying that he has some powerful writing. He's a great catechist of the church and has done a lot of things for it. However, I can also say that there are some signs pointing to the fact that these could be accurate. I can only say from my own experience, I've seen him in person. I've received his blessing in a hierarchical divine liturgy. I believe I was a catechumen at the time. This is in New York City when I was going to college there. And it's even been said that this is back in 2018, so this is before he moved to Hungary, before he met Georgie Suzuki, this Asian character whose non-biological mother, who's this, I guess, woman that has weaseled his way into his life, is apparently the one that's really behind this and extorting Metropolitan Hilarion and blackmailing him. But Metropolitan Hilarion also had a young Asian subdeacon back in 2018 that was hanging out with him. Why he would need an Asian subdeacon when he was working in Russia seems a little bit strange to me. So perhaps the fact that he has certain proclivities for certain types of young men, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some circumstantial evidence that I myself had been witness to that could put some validity behind those rumors. But putting all of that aside, we're going to pray for his eminence, and we're going to hope that these accusations really are untrue, because it would be a horrible thing, mostly for his soul, but also, of course, for the church in general if those things are to be true. But moving on to some other crazy news in the church, many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the situation on Athos with Esfigmenou, the one schismatic old calendarist monastery of the 20 major Athonite monasteries on the peninsula. They are about to be raided by Greek police, and basically the schismatic brotherhood will be forced out of the historic monastery and the grounds and the walls, and be replaced by the newest Esfigmenou Brotherhood, which was founded in 2005, I believe 2 years after they initially schismed, which was 2003. And the thing about Esfigmenou is, yes, they're all under the Greek Old Calendarists, but even within their monastery, 5 different Old Calendarist bishops and synods are represented. Of course, the abbot Methodius, who was convicted in 2013 of throwing Molotov cocktails and explosive devices at police and bailiffs in Carius when him and other monks barricaded themselves in the Esfigmenou administrative offices in, the administrative capital Carius of Mount Athos. And, they were trying to be basically forced out by this bulldozer that was going to knock down their door. They had barricaded it in, and they were throwing Molotov cocktails. It's a very crazy story, and they've been sentenced multiple times. I believe their sentences have been reduced to only a few years now. I don't even know physically where Abbot Methodius is, but there's a faction in the monastery that is less extreme, that is not under the abbot, that are still schismatic. So a very interesting set of characters in there, but the more important reality is that despite these crazy guys, that they aren't Orthodox, the fact that the Greek authorities are pretty much trying to end Mount Athos's autonomy from the actual Hellenic Republic. The Greek government itself is horrible, and I've talked to many people that go to Mount Athos all the time, priests, monks, and they do not support a sphygmonu. They are disgusted by the fact that they mock saints like Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios. They call them, new calendarist clowns and these sorts of things. But the fact of the matter is that they are part of Mount Athos. Those are Athonite monks that made a wrong decision that doesn't give the Greek government the right to violate the old autonomy. I mean, Mount Athos is supposed to be autonomous and run by the council of the abbots of the monasteries and Byzantine law. And effectively, with this expulsion, Athos is just going under the full jurisdiction of the Hellenic Republic, which was horrible. We know that Greece has legalized gay marriage. They are basically a liberal society. They're in debt to the European Union. They are on the side of Israel in many ways in some of this foreign policy stuff. So it's very unfortunate. And I'm going to read some writing from Nick Stamatakis, the editor of Helleniscope, a good, a friend of us and who has published some of my writing. And he says this: "It's not only a sphygmonu anymore, it seems. We are now hearing reports that the Greek police are preparing an operation not only against a sphygmonu monastery, but against the Russian monastery of Pantelimon and the Bulgarian, Serbian, and Romanian monasteries." Also, Exopsalamos reports that a series of meetings between the Greek authorities and the self-governing committee of Athos, consisting of the leaders of the monasteries, took place in the last few days. My evaluation, this is Nick Stamatakis, of the situation is as follows. The Mitsotakis government has received clear orders from their globalist puppet masters to eliminate the self-governance of Athos, in place of for over 1,000 years. The Western globalists cannot achieve their goals of reducing Orthodoxy and Christianity to an absurdity as they attempted to do in the Paris Olympics, until they eliminate the bastion of Orthodoxy, the true ark of Christianity, at Athos. Furthermore, the degenerate Patriarch Bartholomew will never achieve to unify Orthodoxy with Catholicism as long as Athos exists. This explains the urgency. Of course, the excuse for the police operation is that quote-unquote Russian agents operate in Athos. There may be a few of them, nobody can deny this possibility, but they can be in many other places. This is not enough of a reason to desecrate and destroy Athos, and I completely agree. And look, as sphygmonu, they made a mistake, but that doesn't mean that we can totally disrupt the status quo of the governing body of Athos. And I think the fact is that as sphygmonu, if they come back into communion, I've heard that that was the place where the canonical monasteries would just send their kind of crazy guys, and it was kind of a good dumping ground to have. So I think the monastery should be working in their own autonomy to bring those brothers back into the fold, not caving to this nonsense. Dimitri, I would love your thoughts.
I think I can completely agree here. Despite the fact that, yes, the old calendarists are very conservative, we do need to keep in mind schism, in any case, opens the gates to demonic influences, which is why we even see internal schisms within the old calendarists. I mean, we saw the same of the old believers in Russian history. Old believers essentially descended into a certain sectarianism that we saw really prior to the revolution, where you had these Dukhobors, essentially these really weird sects all around Russia, and which essentially dismembered the Russian Empire like zombies, right? Eventually, this is what schism does. It just, you lose your soul, and it very much is this zombie-like state that you're in. You're in a church, but there is no grace. And this is what happened to the Roman Catholics, which is why they, of course, had the internal massive schism with like the future Protestants, etc. This is the same old thing that keeps happening. It's probably the same demons who are in charge of all of this matter. So definitely, we need to just keep the Athonite monks in our prayers, all of them, collectively speaking, because Mount Athos, again, is one of the beacons of Orthodox Christianity. And yeah, it's definitely under the attack. The New World Order is seeking to infiltrate and, I think, corrupt Mount Athos and some of its institutions, whether it's through supporting Ukrainian schism or having the Greek state further be involved, which is definitely compromised by Freemasons and LGBTQ type politicians, or even trying to, very scandalously have women attend Mount Athos and, pointing out the fact that it's misogynistic and it's anti-women, all this weird stuff. They always attack the church. They always attack our monastics first and foremost, because these are the people on the front lines working for the Orthodox Church, essentially praying for the world and praying for their own respective countries, which is why I think we see monasteries in Ukraine get attacked, and also in Greece at the moment. It's happening all over the world, Conrad, kind of linearly if you think about it.
No, I totally agree, and I've heard all sorts of things from the Ephraimite monks here in America about what's going on in Athos and how the spiritual warfare is dramatically increasing as things get crazy with the Third World War and the fulfillment of these prophecies. And I can break a little bit of personal news here for the true fans that are listening here late into the episode. I will be going to Mount Athos and Cyprus at the end of August And those tickets, those plane tickets were not cheap. So I want to thank all of the supporters, especially those behind the paywall, for pretty much making this a reality. I should be meeting and possibly interviewing Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu, as well as visiting Philotheo, Karakalo, Zolgaratho, and some other Athonite monasteries. So I'm going to be keeping everybody posted. Be sure to follow us on the socials for that. But to make more of these trips possible, it really is helpful to get behind the paywall, listen to all of our Ether Hour episodes, and give us that $7 a month or $75 a year, because it allows us to do stuff like this that can really help, I think, benefit the English-speaking Orthodox world and regarding content, as well as, do some good things, I think, for preventing and hopefully softening the blow of World War III, right? So I want to thank everybody for the support and encourage people, if they want to see more things like, me going to Russia, me going to Athos, me going to these conferences, even around America, please consider supporting us at worldwarnow.co. But I have some final news I want to break about the U.S. Of course, we got to talk about the situation with Kamala and Trump. Of course, as predicted, Kamala is enjoying her bump. She is not surpassing Donald Trump or anything like that, but is very much, relevant. The media is shilling her. Everybody's coalescing. She is now the understood nominee. People are thinking about her vice presidency. So the fact of the matter is that there is a chance that Trump can lose to Kamala Harris. I think he was much more likely to beat Joe Biden. And now that Kamala, who's younger, she's got this energy behind her, pop culture is coalescing around her, there's a much greater chance that Donald Trump faces a legitimate defeat here. On the one hand, though, there are still a lot of indicators that Trump is likely to win. I still think that's the more likely outcome, but it's going to be a real fight. I don't think people can get too confident on this. And the reality is that Harris is aligning herself as the less pro-Israel candidate. So that's probably, ironically, one of the things in Trump's favor for winning the election, because world Jewry and the Zionists and big money are lining up to support him. We've seen this rightward turn from Jews. We saw how weirdly balanced CNN was with Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, two Zionist Jews, seeming to be okay with Trump on the stage once again, because they realized that, well, this guy might be better for Israel. And that's something that all of Jewry is currently experiencing, and that politics around the world is going to have to grapple with, right? So unless you have any thoughts on the situation in the U.S. or anything else I said, Dimitri, or really anything from this week or World War III, feel free to let us know, and then we're going to close on out.
Yeah, just wanted to say, look, Kamala Harris, she's a good debater. She was one of the more impressive debaters, if you recall, Conrad, the Democrat primaries in 2020. Like, she was one of the more, sort of well-spoken people on stage. So I don't think Trump will be able to run circles around her coming. I think it's the 10th of September when the next presidential debates will be on. So I think we'll be able to
Well, I
clearly
think
see.
Trump has actually said they might not even be doing that. He's thrown some cold water on if he's even going to show up, because, he's kind of playing some games, saying that she might not even be the nominee. But I think you're right. It's going to be more of a challenge than Sleepy Joe.
Oh yeah, for sure, and she definitely has some connection to Democrat elites behind the scenes. Her sort of, shall we say, sexual history is very well known. It's quite scandalous in the U.S. It's a very weird lady with a lot of people probably have a very dark blackmail material on her. So she's very much bought and paid for. I don't think she's beneficial to any Christians of the U.S. So I think, and it's very tough. I think this will be tough for Christians to choose either party to vote for. But I think we all know which particular party, or which demon has the shorter horns in this particular discussion, right? So just as Saint Paisios once said, you have to vote for the lesser evil. I think, if I'm paraphrasing him correctly,
That was Elder Ephraim, actually.
Elder Ephraim, exactly, yeah. So the wise Athonite monk. So this all kind of comes back to this, like, what do you do in modern elections? And essentially, yeah, you have to just vote for the lesser of two evils, because these globalists don't really give you much of a choice these days, unfortunately. But in terms of smaller news stories, and this probably, on one hand, it's some bad news in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has removed some more. Just remember, we mentioned how they removed Saint Nicholas II and the Royal Martyrs from their new church books that are being published at the moment. Their sort of veneration on the 17th of July and the 18th of July for Saint Elizabeth and Barbara, and those sort of saints are being removed from future worship in some of the books which are being given to priests. Unfortunately, they removed several other feast days dedicated to the Kazan Theotokos icon, the really famous miracle-working icon. The Greek Orthodox Byzantine Iveron icon was also removed, and the seven-arrow Theotokos, as well as some other Theotokos lesser-known miracle-working icons. So for some reason, the liberal wing of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical one, is very much working on this strange disconnecting itself from sort of Russian imperial culture, we can call, which is bizarre. But The positive news, right, is of course we have to end it on a good note. We have witnessed the creation of a new Orthodox feast day this week. The Russian Orthodox Church has officially announced that the feast of moving the Holy Trinity icon from the museum, which it has, the Holy Trinity icon of Andrei Rublev's Trinity, which we love so much, and we speak about it. We've spoken about it, I think, quite a few times on the show now. It has, since its move back to the Trinity Sergius Lavra, that move and that is the feast day itself. So the return of the icon is the new feast day, which will now be celebrated in July. I have to get the exact dates for next week's show, but it will be celebrated in July of every year in the Russian Orthodox Church. So that's quite wonderful, I think. And the Russians are, the church is very much alive, and it's very much, not only are there new saints, new martyrs, new monastics, new ascetics, but also new icons and new sort of movements or Orthodox relics are also being celebrated. So that's always a good thing.
That's amazing. I think people forget that it's not just saints that are born and live holy lives, but there are even sanctified events that are always to be commemorated in the future on the church calendar that still take place today. People forget that that's not just something that takes place, in the 1500s or in the 400s or in the Byzantine or Russian empires, right? Like, that's still happening, and maybe that is a sign of a resurgent Orthodox empire and even a coming emperor if these type of events are increasing and are being recognized by the church as such, right? So I want to talk about something else, some good news in the church, and wrap things up, but I have to report, as we've been recording, some big things have happened in northern Israel. The IDF is actually withdrawing multiple battalions from the Gaza Strip and sending them to defend the Beit Lid base, which is under siege by Kahanist militias. You may have heard of this. There's this base in Israel that supposedly has been torturing and sodomizing Palestinian prisoners, and basically some of the guards there were arrested by Israeli police, and the Kahanist hardcore Zionists, supported by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, are basically sieging this and threatening the police and saying they need to let these guys go and that this is anti-Israeli and all this kind of stuff. So very interesting development. Of course, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, for some reason, have been given insane amounts of authority as part of their place in the cabinet as, finance minister and national security minister. And of course, we know that Smotrich has large-scale control over large regions of the West Bank. And Ben-Gvir himself is basically the head of the police force in Israel. So some have said that he even delayed sending the police to the base as the Kahanist militias besieged it. So very interesting developments. Of course, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are pretty much the active forces of the Antichrist working in the political world right now. So of course, we're going to be tracking them and Netanyahu, their enabler. So very interesting news, to say the least there. Follow us on Telegram, worldwarnow.co, and Twitter to stay up to date with the latest updates from the Holy Land. I gotta save the plugs till the very end, but this final, more positive story is from our good friend Metropolitan Tikhon of Crimea, and this is also a story from Ortho Christian. I'm going to read a little bit. This is the new Chersonesos Museum Church Complex in Crimea, commemorating the site where St. Vladimir was baptized, will open to the public on July 30th. His Eminence Metropolitan Tikhon of Simferopol in Crimea, the head of the Patriarchal Culture Council, who has overseen the project for several years, presented the project at a special press conference on Tuesday. New Chersonesos will be able to receive up to 50,000 guests per day, and according to Metropolitan Tikhon, will be the largest historical archaeological park in Russia. Admission is free. And so this is, of course, commemorating where Russia was baptized by St. Cyril and Methodius, when St. Vladimir became an Orthodox Christian, where the Byzantine legacy of Orthodoxy was transmitted into the future Russian Empire, the Russian people, the Slavic people. So very, very, very awesome thing to see that this is going to be basically one of the largest, most relevant museums and cultural sites in all of Russia in Crimea, the new territory nonetheless. So it's very cool. It's actually the Museum of Antiquity in Byzantium. That's the largest part of the park. And the area of this museum is over 22,000 square meters, and its exhibits will be artifacts collected over the past 200 years and discovered during recent excavations. So a lot of great things are happening in the restored world of Orthodoxy that is emerging out of, in Greece, the Ottoman yokes, in Russia, the Soviet yokes, and here in America, the liberal secular yoke as Orthodoxy rises here. Some say that Orthodoxy is even the fourth largest united communal denomination of Christians in America. So praise God for that. But with all of that, worldwarnow.co, support us, get behind the paywall, listen to every episode of Ether Hour. You get the full episodes. If you get behind the paywall, you get full articles, thousands of words on ritual regicide and these other things that Dimitri has translated every week, again, as an Ether Hour, so it's a good investment to get behind that paywall, and it supports the show. worldwarnow.substack.com works as well, worldwarnow.co. They both are the correct link. Obviously, follow us on Twitter, worldwarnow_. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now, and leave a comment and share the channel on both. Obviously, if you're on Substack or YouTube, subscribe to the other one. It helps us out to be on both. Obviously, subscribe on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That is our best 24-hour news feed. We have a backup Rumble account, World War Now, as well. And with all of that, again, thank you so much for listening. Be sure to share these episodes. And with all of that, Dimitri, I will give you the last word.
Thank you guys for your support, and we look forward to seeing some of the great content, Conrad, that you will show us from Cyprus and Mount Athos, because this is the first, you can say, official World War Now expedition abroad, and we'll be giving you guys exclusive footage, naturally, commenting on some of these regions and holy places from around the world. So definitely looking forward to your trip, Conrad, this August, and seeing exactly what that will bring to us. So thank you for your support, guys, the listeners, those who've listened to the end of the show. You've made it all possible for us.
God bless everybody.